So, good afternoon, good evening, or maybe even good morning to you all, depending on where in the world you are. Really good to see so many of you signed in right now. Welcome to this webinar. It's the last one that I'm doing today. I've done 3 so far, and I had a few technical problems on one of them, but other than that, they have all gone very well. Great attendance, lots of great questions, which has been really, really good. So let's get cracking. A little bit about me. So 20 years working as a cinematographer in broadcast TV, cinema, commercials and corporate video. I actually started back in 1986, and one of the shows that I worked on way back then was actually BBC's Top Gear. And yes, it has been going that long, although it was a very different show back then. I had done motor racing, motorsports, Formula One, windsurfing, snowboarding, you name it, in sort of adventure sports, and then kids TV, documentaries, corporate videos, and now I shoot a lot of stock footage of severe weather, etc. I'm a Sony ICE independent certified expert. I'm not employed by Sony as such, but I do get paid from time to time by Sony to hold events. This is not one of those. Sony haven't done a webinar like this for some time now, so I decided that it was time to do one, and in the future I shall be seeking sponsorship to run these on a regular basis. I write and maintain the website xdcam-user.com, which is probably how you found this today. The big thing though today, the key thing about this webinar for it to work at its best is to ask questions. That's why I'm here today, that's why I'm here for, is to answer your questions. I have an enormous, great big PowerPoint file here with about 200 slides in it, hopefully covering most things that may come up as questions. If not, I'll make it up as I go along. The webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link either tonight or tomorrow to that recording, so you can download it and listen again should you wish to listen to my voice for yet another hour. Disclaimer first though, I always try to give the accurate and reliable information, but I cannot be held responsible for errors. I am only human. I do make mistakes. Technology changes quickly. I make every effort that I can to give you accurate, helpful, useful, meaningful information, but things change. Sometimes I get given incorrect information and errors do creep in. And also on top of that, of course, video production is a creative craft, so any advice that I give is based either on best industry practice or my own personal experience, and there are many, many ways to skin the television cat. So lots of ways of achieving the same result or the best result, and different people will have different opinions on what is best. Some people like Picasso, some people like Rembrandt. Both are correct in that they like both. They are just different choices. So just bear that in mind when you're listening to any of the questions or anything I have to say. You know, sometimes there are different ways to approach things. So you should see a question box on your screen where you can type in those questions. There's a couple come through already, but keep them coming in, keep them fired up, and we'll try and answer as many of them as I can. Before I do get on to questions though, just a little bit of news for you. It's been brought to my attention on the website that there are problems using the new 440 megabyte per second XQD cards in the BMW F5 and 55, and maybe the FS7 too. These cards are identified by the sticker on the front that shows 2 speeds, R440 and W440, as you can see here in this image. The older cards, which work absolutely perfectly fine, just have a single 400 megabit per second label on there. These new cards, been out about 6 weeks now, have got the 2 speeds on there. The issues on the F5 and 55 will be fixed in firmware version 8, which is due out in roughly about 3 weeks, something like middle of August. So it's coming very, very soon. If anyone has had any experience with these cards in an FS7, I would like to hear back. I have heard rumors that there may be problems with that camera as well. I'm sure it's just a case of a firmware update if there are problems, but please let me know so I can pass on any information that I have. And finally, a couple of shameless plugs. BMW F5 and F55 mic holders that I used to make myself are now available from Shapeways. If you go to Shapeways and just Google PMW F5 mic holder, you'll find them there. Much higher quality than I could ever make myself. All you need to do is add some rubber bands or O-rings, the details of which are on Shapeways. And I am running a lightning photography and video trip to Arizona in August, where I'll be teaching time-lapse, how to shoot lightning, things like that. It's not really like the tornado chasing. It's much, much safer. There is an element of risk. You don't quite ever know where lightning's going to strike. But we do stay in the same hotel every night. We don't drive and do silly, silly miles. It's normally a lot of fun and a great way to get some amazing footage of lightning and possibly trips up to the Grand Canyon, weather permitting and things like that. So do contact me if it's something you're interested in. So here we go. I've got some questions that have been emailed in and came up a little bit earlier. So we'll kick off with a few of these. So when shooting with the FS7, I usually hand off my footage to someone who will do little or no color correction in these situations. I usually shoot in standard 5, which is Rec 709, if you aren't aware of that. Is this the best and only gamma to shoot with when very little will be done in post? Well, you actually have lots and lots of choices here. If no color correction or anything like that's going to be done, then you don't want to use log. You do want to use some form of standard gamma curve. So let me just jump forward in my slide deck here and find the slides that relate to this. So just bear with me for 1 second while I just whiz up here. So you have lots of choices. So standard gamma, Rec 709 has a dynamic range of about 6 stops. And then on top of that, we normally add the knee, which is highlight compression that squashes the highlights, gives you an extra 3 or 4 stops of dynamic range squashed into a very, very small recording range. That works fine, but it does give you that television look, especially with highlights. A typical problem would be somebody with a bald head and the top of their head's catching the light, and because that highlight is being compressed by the knee and the levels all squashed together, the colors kind of look a bit funky. It has very low contrast, and it just really doesn't quite look right. So in that situation, what can you do? I actually rarely now shoot with standard Rec 709, instead preferring where I can to use either a hypergamma or a cine gamma. So in the FS7, F5, F55, that would be a hypergamma. In the FS5, A6300, A7S, it would be a cine gamma. And these gammas, instead of having a hard knee that comes on, and when it comes on is very, very aggressive at compressing those highlights, it has a highlight roll-off. So it's much more film-like, it's much more pleasing to the eye to look at, and I think it looks much nicer. But the only thing is that you do need to expose the hypergammas and cine gammas very slightly darker than you do the standard gamma, and that's because your skin tones, which sit around this area in that sort of 70% range, somewhere around about here, are already creeping into the compressed part of the curve. And if you overexpose, they go a bit flat, they start to wash out. So when I'm using hypergammas or cine gammas, I look in the viewfinder and I open and close the aperture a little bit, looking at faces and things like that, because as soon as you start to overexpose, you'll actually see that contrast start to go away in the faces, and then just back it off a little bit and you'll be good. And the great thing about them is actually they are very forgiving of overexposure. If you are overexposed a bit, well, it just looks a little flatter than it should, and that's about as bad as it gets. So they are very, very tolerant of being overexposed. But just watch what's happening with faces and skin tones. If I'm using zebras with them, I'll normally set the zebras to about 60% to allow for that, instead of using zebras at the usual 40%. So let me just have a look at what other questions we've got here. I'll take one live now. So what's my approach to low light situations? Shooting log in this camera has given me very unpleasing amounts of noise in the blacks and midtones. I've yet to find a LUT to apply that I like if shooting in anything other than full daylight. Let's face it, that log only does one thing well, and that is give you a bigger dynamic range. In every other respect, log is a massive compromise. Let me just find, actually, just one thing I did have here, actually. Standard gamma with no knee example. No, that's not what I wanted. I wanted to show you just this slide before we go on. I'll come back to that question in a second. Hypergammas and cinegammas. Cinegamma 1 is the same as hypergamma number 4. Very, very big dynamic range with cinegamma number 1, 460%. As I say, this will be available later for you to download, so you can come back to it. Coming back to log and low light, let's just have a look at this slide here. One of the things that you're doing when you shoot with log is you are taking a very, very big range of the sensor and squeezing it into your small capture range, your XAVC recording. You've only got so much data in there. The more you squeeze into there, the less data, the less code values per stop you're going to have. 709 standard gamma, it's 6 stops in the mid-range with a couple of stops squeezed into the highlights. In the mid-range, you're going to have 200 or more code values per stop and lots of data in the shadows as well. When you go to S-Log2 or S-Log3, if I go to this graph here, you'll actually see that per stop, these are f-stops along here. And if I take a stop, let's just take this one here, from here to here, with a 10-bit camera, you've got about 70, maybe 80 code values. So you have far, far fewer code values per stop, even in this part of the picture, in the above middle grey, in the brighter parts of the picture. 709, in that same range, you have 2 or 3 times as much data per stop. When we go down into the shadows down here, this is middle grey, so anything below about 40% exposed. Let's go down to this stop here, and we'll look at S-Log2. We're going from code value 128 roughly to code value 140, something like that. You've probably only got 15 code values recording that dark stop. That is very, very little data. If you try and stretch that at all in any way, shape or form, to lift it, to brighten it, it's going to look like rubbish. It really is. And there's nothing you can do about that. That's just the way log is. This is why I always urge people when you're shooting with log to actually expose it extra bright, to expose between 1 and 2 stops brighter than the Sony recommended levels, because you don't want stuff down here in the darker part of the curve. There's just no data down there. Log is excellent at recording information up here, up in the highlights, all the way up to the very, very top, all the way up to here. You have the same amount of data. There's no highlight roll-off. The brightest stop contains as much data as one down here. But in the shadows down here, there is very, very little data indeed. So if you can't expose log correctly, or better still, 1 to 2 stops over the Sony base level, so that means having white in the log recording at 70%, then basically, excuse my language, you're screwed. And no LUT in the world is ever going to help you. Log is designed to get maximum dynamic range, and it makes a lot of other compromises to do that. If you're shooting in low light, go back to standard gamma, go back to a cine gamma or a hyper gamma. You're likely to get a much better result, simply because you're going to have more data per stop. You're going to be able to expose it, get the picture up into the brighter part of the curve, because you don't need as much of a light range to do it. And if you're shooting in low light, dynamic range is rarely a problem. Log will not get you out of trouble in low light. If anything, it's going to make it worse for you. So I'm just going to come back to my questions up at the head of the presentation, we'll take another one of those. Okay, so and this actually carries on from that. It's often written that Cine EI is higher quality than custom mode. I assume this is either F5, F55 or FS7. Why is that? Because aside from looking closely at the noise levels, I can't see any difference. Well, there isn't a lot of difference, really. Now, the problem, though, is that in custom mode, there's a lot of other stuff turned on that you don't want. And one thing in particular that's on by default is noise reduction. If you're going to grade log footage in post-production and it's noise reduced before it's encoded, you are much, much more likely to see banding artifacts in your footage. Noise reduction works by averaging out levels in the picture, and when you start averaging levels, you introduce banding artificially, which you probably won't see when you're shooting it, but when you grade it, you're more likely to see it in your footage after you grade it. So Cine EI mode, by default, noise reduction is turned off, and I really strongly recommend you turn it off. Other things are you don't have the correct color gamuts to match with the correct log curve. So if you are working with lookup tables in post-production, you're going to have to generate your own special lookup tables to compensate and to allow you to work with those odd combinations of matrix and S-log gamma curves. So Cine EI, it's not higher quality per se, but it does bring you many benefits, and in particular is the ability to expose brighter, to expose that log curve easily 1 or 2 stops brighter by shooting at a low EI. And then leading on from this, got another question: is it possible to shoot Cine EI when handing off the footage, so someone who doesn't plan to do any color correction? So is it possible to shoot Cine EI when handing off the footage to someone who doesn't plan to do any color correction? If so, what would those settings be? Well, yeah, if you're not going to do any color correction, then obviously you don't want to use log. So what you can do in Cine EI is bake in a LUT. And that does actually open up all kinds of possibilities and all kinds of options, because you can do a lot more with LUTs than you can with the scene files or picture profiles in a camera. So I'm just going to come out of the presentation here and show you a tool that I use a lot. So hopefully this will all work nicely. And that is this software here called LUTCalc. Now, LUTCalc, it's very low cost. You can download it for yourself, use it on your computer, and what you can do is generate your own lookup tables. So we have my record gamma here, and it's set to S-log3 and S-gamma3 Cine, and then what I can do is I can create a whole range of different gamma curves, or lookup tables rather. And I've actually set up from a previous presentation earlier, we had some questions about HDR. And this is actually creating an HDR lookup table, so you could shoot directly to HDR if you needed to do that. But I can actually create all kinds of different looks. I can have Cine gammas, I can have different Canon and Nikon looks, ARRI looks, and things like that. So I could go for a Panasonic Vericam type look, and we want probably 709 color, but again, we've got different color options as well. So we can make our own lookup tables that we can load into the camera, and when you want to do that, you want to create a camera LUT and for Sony. And the other thing to consider is also to put in an exposure offset. So let's set this to FS7. And if we want less noise, what we need to do is we can put in a -1 or -2 stop correction, and that will give us less noise in the final image when we create that LUT. Or of course you can use EI as well and shoot at a lower EI. So this would be the only way that I would work if I was handing footage off to somebody shooting in Cine EI, not going to be graded, is to create a LUT or download the LUTs that I have on my website. There's loads of LUTs on my website that you can download. Load that into the camera, create the look in the camera and bake it in, burn it in while you're recording it so that it's there before it goes to your client, so they don't need to worry about grading. Okay, so more questions are here. Considering I'm shooting the best format available for those cameras, how should I expose those cameras for future HDR grading? If I am shooting S-log3, would I use the same IRE for skin tones as for 709 finishing? Couple of different things to be considered though. So for shooting for HDR, it's really important that you get your exposure right. HDR, and this was discussed a lot in the HDR presentation earlier, and there'll be links floating around for that, so you can probably download it and have a listen. HDR is less tolerant of incorrect exposure than standard gammas. When you think about it, if you shoot with a wide dynamic range with S-log, and you go to 709, you're squashing your levels together. So any noise, any grain, all gets squashed down and becomes less. When you're shooting for HDR, you're not squashing those levels together. In effect, compared to 709, you're expanding them out. So any noise, any grain, any problems are going to become more apparent and more visible. So it's really important that you get your exposure just right for HDR. And again, it's the same thing. You want to shoot 1 to 2 stops brighter than the Sony recommended levels. So instead of having white at around 60% for S-log2 and S-log3, your white's going to be at around about 70%. and skin tones with the log would be at about 55 to 60%. So you want to expose nice and bright. That keeps your noise levels down, and that's going to give you the best looking HDR. If you're shooting via a 709 LUT, then and exposing via the LUT, then skin tones are exposed as usual. 709 via the LUT, 70% skin tones, if that's what you wish to use. But if you're shooting and looking at the log, then your skin tones are going to be much, much lower. They're going to be, if you're 1.5 to 2 stops overexposed, around the 55 to 60% mark. If you're shooting log, I really do recommend that you get a grey card or a white card and try and make use of those where you can. I know it's not always possible, but you really do need to do something like that until you're used to shooting with log, so you get a feel for what it looks like if you're not using a LUT. If you're using a LUT, just use the plain vanilla 709-800 LUT that's in the cameras, set the EI to 800 on an F5, FS7, and just expose as you would do normally. Skin tones at 70%, white is 90%, and you'll all be good to go. That would give you really good results. Okay, so another question. Different cameras force very different minimum ISOs in S-Log. What's the theory behind this? Why does the A7S and A7S II with the same sensor force very different ISOs? It's a good question. It's a very complex subject, and actually I have a similar question here as well. Oops. Let me just come back to that, because you're not the first person to ask this question. The reason why we have varying ISOs for these cameras is because what we're trying to do all the time is get maximum dynamic range. So the sensor itself is, and I don't know for sure, I believe is a 16-bit sensor. We have a 16-bit signal coming off the sensor. To get 14 stops, you normally need 16 bits, you need 16-bit processing and things like that. Now the processors, the image processors in the FS700, FS7, A6300, A7S, A7S II, they are all different image processors. And those image processors will be operating at different bit depths. I don't know the numbers, Sony don't publish them, and it's a case of pairing the sensor with that digital signal processor, DSP, at the optimum range for both the sensor and the processor to get the very best results. And that's why we see variation between the A7S and the A7S Mark II, because they're using different signal processors. And it's obviously Sony have done a lot of work on this to find that optimum point where we get the best dynamic range with the least possible noise. Something to add to that, ISO. Well, ISO, it's not a sensitivity measure on a video camera. It really isn't. I posted recently a test you can do with an FS7 or any of the cameras with the FS7, F5, F55, those cameras, where if you start off with standard gamma, 800 ISO, and you switch to S-Log2 in custom mode, the ISO goes up from, if it's an FS7, from 800 to 2000 ISO, but the white level and the skin tone level drops down. How is that possible? How can you raise the ISO but end up with darker whites and darker skin tones? How does that work? Well, it doesn't, and because ISO isn't actually a measure of the camera's sensitivity. The reason the ISO goes up, and you have to think about this for a moment, is if you set your light meter at 800 ISO, and let's say it's saying f5.6, you switch the camera over to S-Log, you set the light meter now to 2000 ISO, it's going to tell you to close the aperture by 1.3 stops. Now, if you don't close the aperture, when you switch from 709 to S-Log, white drops down from 90% down to 70%. But the correct exposure, the correct Sony exposure, is 60%. Well, of course, if you change the ISO on the light meter, it's going to tell you to close the aperture. You close the aperture down by 1.3 stops, and as if by magic, white is now at 60%. So you get the correct exposure. Now, if you do the same thing in the camera but use gain instead, start off with Rec 709 and then switch to log, the gain stays at 0 dB in both cases. So the sensitivity of the camera is not changing. The thing that is changing is the curve, the gamma curve. The reason the ISO goes up is to trick you, is to fool you if you are using a light meter into closing the aperture down to let less light onto the camera so that you get that lower exposure. But of course, if you're letting less light onto the sensor, you're going to get a noisy, grainy picture, which is where we come back to when you shoot with log, it's normally better to shoot 1 to 2 stops over. Then you're opening that aperture back up again, back actually more or less to where it would be if you were shooting with 709, and then you get a similar noise level. So ISO isn't actually telling you the sensitivity of the camera, it's giving you a setting that you can put into a light meter so you get the correct aperture setting. But the sensitivity of the camera is measured in dB, and it is a different thing. So lots of stuff around ISOs and things like that. If you were to work in dB, what you'd actually find is that all of the cameras, FS7, FS700, A6300, they'd all be at 0 dB. They would always all be at the point where none of them are adding extra gain to the picture when you're in S-Log2. There are differences in brightness, though, due to the different image processors in the camera. So it's 0 dB, but that does happen to result in different brightnesses. So if you're using a light meter, we need to have different ISOs to compensate for that. Okay, lots more questions to go through. Biggest problem I have is the FS5 doesn't do sequential file naming. It's really grating my cheese. Yes, I'm assuming what you mean there is, well, there should be sequential, but if you change a card, it goes back to 0. It is annoying, and I don't believe there is a simple fix for that. You can, there are workarounds by leaving the last clip on the card and things like that, but that's a bit of a pain in the backside to do that, to be honest. You can use Adobe Bridge to rename the clips. That works in cards, but unfortunately, no, there isn't a simple way around it. I wish I had. I wish I could say something better. That is, I'll pass it on to Sony. You know, that I'm getting lots and lots of people complaining that it doesn't help, and I'm the same. I have big projects with lots of FS5 footage in there, and I have lots of clip 0s and lots of clip 1s and so on, and it is a bit of a pain in the backside. Perhaps that will be addressed in a firmware update in the future, although I wouldn't hold out too much for it. And you know, as I've mentioned, you know, ways around it. Yeah, try and use Adobe Bridge or something like to rename and renumber your clips. You can actually add sequential numbers in Bridge. Another question is, so let's take another question here. Is there a loss in quality when using the digital extender on the FS7? I don't see it, but I notice the peaking doesn't show up as often when shooting with the extender on. Yes, there is a drop in image quality. So let me go to some different slides in my presentation while we look at why that is. It's very, very slight, and it's going to depend on what you're shooting, but there is a change in the image quality. The sensor is a Bayer sensor, where the pixels are laid out in a type of grid pattern, and hopefully I'll find the slide that shows what that looks like. So the pixels are laid out like this. So across the sensor, which is 4K or 4096 of pixels across in full frame mode, you only have 2048 of green, and the resolution in an image comes primarily from the green channel. That's where most of the picture information is. That's where our eyes are most sensitive. Our eyes are most sensitive to green. So most of the detail in a picture comes from the green channel. But as you can see, with the pixels arranged like that, like this, there isn't a green pixel at every single location. So the resolution in 4K, when you're using the full frame, it's not 4K resolution. It's a little bit less than that, 3.2, 3.4K, depending on what you're shooting. When you go into crop mode, you're only now using the very center of that 4K wide sensor. So you only have 2K's worth of pixels. So that means, because there's only 2K wide of pixels in total, there's only 1,000 of green. So your resolution is going to be lower than HD. It's going to be about 1.4 to 1.5K, depending on what you're shooting. When you shoot in HD and you use the full sensor, the whole sensor is red, The camera takes a 4K image, downscales it to HD. It looks really, really good because it's so sharp, because it is so crisp. Peaking works really well. When you go into crop mode, you're taking a 2K image that doesn't have even HD resolution and using that. So it's never going to look as good as if you can shoot with the full frame mode. Like I say though, it does depend on what you're shooting, how much texture there is. If you're shooting let's say a romantic, a soft scene in a bedroom scene, something like that, or people, very soft scene, I doubt you'll see any difference. But if you were outside in the day shooting buildings, architecture, lots of straight lines and lots of texture, lots of hard textures, things like that, then you're much more likely to see that difference. So you do need to be aware of that. Let me go back to questions and pick up the next one. Okay, so when manually white balancing, what IRE should the white be at with different gamma settings? And that's a really good question. First of all, I would say wherever possible, use a grey card, not a white card. Now, I know it's called white balance, but what you're trying to do with white balance is eliminate color in the shot. So when you have something that's white, if it's pure white, it will have zero color. Now, something to understand about the way video works is that as you go up in brightness, you have a 0 to 100% recording range. And that is shared between the brightness information, the luminance, and the color. So generally, as you go brighter and brighter and brighter, you actually have less and less color. So if you can do your white balance with a gray card, which would be exposed typically at around about 60%, so 50 to 60% for a standard gamma, something like that. And we're talking about for white balance, not for exposure. Then because it's lower down the range, there's going to be more color in the image at that point. So any color shifts are better eliminated, better reduced, better balanced out. When you use a white card and you'd expose it at 70 or 80%, it's not as accurate. So do invest in a good quality grey card. You will get a more accurate white balance with a grey card. So standard gammas, typically white wants to be at around about 80% for white balancing. With a grey card, you can normally get it to balance at around about 50%. The camera will tell you if the picture is too bright or too dark to balance correctly. But I really do recommend getting a grey card and doing it that way. So more questions, and there are lots. Can I use a polarizing filter with the FS5's variable ND filter? Absolutely, yes, you can. The FS5 ND filter doesn't polarize light. It is truly a variable ND filter, and it really is an amazing thing. Another question that I've got actually relating to the use of the ND filter is when I'm using it in auto, does it behave the same as auto iris? So yes, it does. To make it work in auto, you have to assign it to one of the assignable buttons on the camera, and once it's assigned to one of the assignable buttons, you can just turn it on and off, provided you have the ND filters actually engaged and rotated into place, and then it will operate automatically. And I love it. Shooting outside, doing an interview, and the sun's coming and going from behind clouds, the light levels are going up and down. If you use auto iris, well, your depth of field comes and goes. It gets deeper and shallower, and you can see it, and it doesn't look very nice. Use the variable ND, the auto variable ND. It takes care of it. You barely see those exposure changes. They're much less noticeable because the depth of field isn't changing. The camera does a really, really good job of doing that. And if you're doing time lapse of night to day to night, things like that, and you want to try and keep a constant exposure over the sunrise or sunset, well, of course, you can combine the auto ND with the auto aperture on the camera. Do use a Sony lens if you're going to do that. Don't try and do it with a Canon lens because you'll get steps in the exposure. If you use a Sony lens, auto iris and auto ND together gives you a 10+ stop range, and it's just a fabulous way of controlling, getting a nice constant exposure over sunrises and sunsets and things like that. So lots of options there. So please do keep the questions coming in. This is, after all, for you and not for me, this session. So using the F55, can I expect similar results with Cine EI mode with S-Log and the custom mode with S-Log? I notice in Cine EI there is a greater range of ISOs down to, I think, 300, but custom mode starts at 1250. You have to understand that custom mode and Cine EI are two very, very different things. In custom mode, you are changing the gain of the camera. In the Cine EI mode, you're not changing the gain of the camera, you're changing the brightness of the lookup tables, and the behavior is very different. You only get the benefit of using S-Log, that full large dynamic range at the native ISO of the camera. If you use something other than the native ISO, you will not get the full dynamic range. If you go up in ISO in custom mode, and I have to get this right, you will lose a stop off your highlight range and gain nothing but noise in the shadows. And if you go down in ISO in custom mode, you will lose a stop off your shadows and gain nothing in the highlights. So every time you go up or down a stop of ISO, you are taking away dynamic range and getting nothing back in return. In the Cine EI mode, though, what you do is you shift the exposure index, so the LUTs become brighter or darker, adjust your exposure accordingly. There is no change to the recorded dynamic range, so you always have that 14 stops of dynamic range, and you control your exposure through EI. It's a much, much better way to work, really. Expose with log, you really don't want to use a high ISO because it's going to be so noisy in those shadows. There's no data down there. It's going to look poor. You really want to use Cine EI and use a low EI. I just come across this all the time, people that think that log is a magic bullet for everything. It isn't. It gives you brilliant wide dynamic range, but in low light it's terrible. In trying to use it with high gain, it's terrible. You just want to use it at the base ISO, use it correctly, use it how it's supposed to be used, and if you have to, light the scene to fit the log. Don't try and adjust the ISO to make the log fit the scene, because it won't work. You need to light your scene if you're struggling with light. Wow, a ton of questions suddenly. So is there a possibility to do a exposure compensation when just using the auto ND so that I can go with half stop overexposed or 1.5 stop overexposed with S-Log? Yes, absolutely, you can. So depending on which camera, I don't know which camera this refers to, I'm going to assume it's the FS5. First of all, you have to turn on either auto iris or auto ND, and then if you go into the menu of the camera, in the camera menu you can put in an AE offset, and if you put in an AE offset of plus 1.5, the camera will overexpose or expose 1.5 stops brighter, and you can shoot log that way. It's a really good way of using the FS5 with log. Just set to plus 1.5 and then use auto aperture or auto ND, and your shots will be exposed that 1.5 stops brighter. It's really simple, really easy thing to do with the FS5. Which hypergamma would you use in low light indoors and which hypergamma overcast day outdoor? I have to remember my hypergamma numbers. Let me bring up the appropriate slide. I don't have all the hypergamma numbers listed here. I don't think I have. I might have in the F5 section, perhaps. No. So when you go into the menu of the camera, the hypergammas are described with numbers. So you'll see here I've got here we are. HG1, hypergamma 1, 3250, G36. These numbers mean quite a bit. So the first 3 digits, 325, that's your dynamic range in percent, 325% more dynamic range than 709. So the picture is going to have greater dynamic range, but it's also going to be a little bit flatter because of that. The fourth character, which is either a 0 or a 9, if you look at HG3 and 4, it's a 9, is the peak recording level. When it's a 0, it's 100%. When it's a 9, it's 109%. Anything you're doing for broadcast safe, that you're doing for maybe a news story, something like that's going to go direct to air with no grading, you should use hypergamma 1 or hypergamma 2. or if you're using a Cine gamma, you should use a Cine gamma number 2 to ensure that your material is broadcast safe. The last bit, which is a G and a number, G30, G36, that is your optimum exposure of middle grey. So middle grey exposed at 30% or 33 or 40. And as you can see, actually, in most cases, this is considerably lower, and that's done deliberately because you are getting extra dynamic range. To make space for the greater dynamic range, you pull middle grey down, you pull all your levels down, so your initial 6 stops are recorded in a smaller space, and then that gives you space at the top for your extra dynamic range. So coming back to the question, so low light and indoors, well, there's no point in using 460% dynamic range indoors. You don't need it, it's a waste. So I would use one of the 325% curves. If it's a broadcast program, I would use hypergamma number 1. If it's going to be graded, hypergamma number 3. It's going to be a little bit more contrasty. When the hypergamma number is higher, generally speaking, the picture is less contrasty. When the hypergamma number, the first 3 digits, is lower, it's more contrasty. An overcast outdoor day depends on how overcast. Again, I might well choose to use hypergamma number 3 because I perhaps don't need a huge dynamic range. But if I still am struggling with dynamic range, then I would go to hypergamma number 4 in that case. Has the biggest dynamic range. I'm not a big fan of hypergammas 7 and 8. I don't know, I just don't. Some people like them a lot. They have a bigger dynamic range. I would probably just reserve those for a very high contrast situation, very big dynamic range, a bright sunny day with clouds in the sky, and you want to retain those clouds. But my favorite 2 hypergammas are 3 and 4. They cover most bases, really, those 2 hypergammas. So be great to hear your views on the key technical differences across the range from FS700 through FS5, FS7, F5 and F55. Wow, Lewis, now there's a question and a half. There's a huge amount of differences. I don't really have a slide to show that covers anything there particularly. Really, if we start with the FS700, FS700 is still a great camera. Of course, its biggest restriction is its internal recording is AVC HD. All these cameras have the same sensor, but the FS700, let me start again, FS700 has only got 8-bit AVC, highly compressed AVC HD recording internally. If you've got an external recorder, nice Atomos recorder or an Odyssey or something like that, you can get around that limitation by taking the SDI out. But it's still highly compressed. It has the RAW option as well, which you can take the RAW output, and that gives some really, really good results, and it has great slow motion. So it is still a very capable camera. Ergonomically, I think it is somewhat challenged. It's not the best shape to hold, but you know, it's still a good camera. But when you move up to the FS5, you now have 10-bit internal recording in HD. You have UHD recording now, but in 8-bit internally. But you have the option, of course, again, to strap on an external recorder. It's still only going to be 8-bit in UHD unless you have RAW. So if you have a Shogun or Ninja or something like that, you can get really great 12-bit RAW or ProRes recorded externally if you really want to up the quality. There are differences in the image processing. The FS700, the front end of that camera, I believe, is very, very similar to the FS5 from what I've been able to tell. But then obviously you have a different signal processor that's doing the encoding to XAVC and things like that. And ergonomically, the FS5 really is a much nicer camera. But then you do have the limitation with the FS5 in that it only has basically 2 video processors in the camera. One is normally used for the recording, and the other is used to feed the viewfinder or a monitor. And you have a problem there with that particular camera. When you plug in an external monitor, a conventional monitor, you have to sacrifice the viewfinder when you hit record. And it's a big limitation on that camera. It's compact, it's small, it's low power, it's some really great features, and I do like shooting with it, but it does have some limitations. Then you go up to the FS7, and we're into a whole new processing arena with this camera. Much better processing. It's got the horsepower that's really needed to handle RAW, to handle log and raw properly, and that's why you're able to have the Cine EI mode and things like that, and you don't lose your outputs when you hit record. It is a much more advanced and much more sophisticated camera. The downside to that, of course, more processing power, more things going on, it uses more battery power. So your batteries don't last as long as they do in the FS5 and FS700, which have much less processing power. And obviously then we go up to the F5 and 55, and not a great deal of difference between the 5 and 55. FS7, F5 and 55, very similar, but the big thing about the 5 and 55 is the addition of the external the side panel display. It makes it much easier to use the camera. All your setups and information is there on the side of the camera. And with the version 7 firmware, that really does make it quite a wonderful camera to use. So as you basically go up in price, you go up in processing power, and that does generally tend to result in a better image. FS700, FS5, FS7, they're all outputting 12-bit RAW. There are differences. I don't really understand why there are some differences, but again, I think it's the way the sensor is being matched to the DSP in the camera, the digital processor. 12-bit linear RAW, that is pushing what you can do with 14 stops of dynamic range, but exposed correctly, exposed right, produces a beautiful image. Go up to the F5, F55 with 16-bit linear RAW, absolutely stunning output. Really can grade the pants off that. Really, very, very capable cameras. I'm going to try and crack on through as much of this as I can. Is it possible to mix the image of the FS7 and the A6300 for broadcast production without being too remarkable? A6300, I'm not sure whether it would be really classed as a broadcast camera. It does produce a great picture, really does impress with that little camera. Of course you can mix them. They won't ever match fully though. They are very, very different cameras, very different sensors, very different image processing and everything else. And even if you get the colors to look the same and the contrast to look the same, they're still going to have a different look to them. I mean, obviously if you use, that's actually quite convenient, I've got this slide up. So if you're using the A6300, use something like Cine Gamma #1 and then use Hypergamma #4 in the FS7, that will get them closer, but you're still really going to probably find you're going to need to tweak them and grade them a little bit in post, not a huge amount, but a little bit to try and bring them closer together, and they'll never ever quite look identical. I mean, provided they're two different shots, you know, maybe one angle, another angle, in most cases I'm quite sure you'll get away with it without any big dramas. So how does RAW recording get maximum DR? Well, RAW recording takes the full, in the case of the F5 and 55, takes the full 16-bit signal off the sensor and records it as it is. It doesn't do anything to it, so you're taking the full dynamic range off the sensor and recording it as it comes off the camera, off the sensor. That's how you get the maximum dynamic range. FS5, FS7, FS700, it's 12-bit. So Sony are doing a bit of jiggery-pokery and voodoo science to get the 16-bit data off the sensor down into 12 bits. I don't quite know how it's done. They use some form of floating point math to do it, and the upshot of that is it rounds up data in the shadows. So you still get the full dynamic range of the camera, but in less bits than you perhaps really should have. And the end result is, yes, you've got the full dynamic range, but your shadows can be a bit noisy and look a bit grainy if you don't expose it nice and bright. So once again, expose nice and bright. Log and RAW, these things, they will never ever give you a camera that's suddenly going to work in the dark. You still have to expose it properly, or better still, get your lights out and light the scene. You'll never ever see noise in most movies in night scenes, and the reason for that is they are lit, and generally speaking the foreground is lit very, very brightly while the background is allowed to remain very, very dark, and that gives you that very deep night contrast where faces are relatively bright but the background is very, very dark. But it's done through lighting, not done through trying to use gamma curves or high ISOs or large amounts of gain. Things like that. Is there an alternative of the white balance in Cine EI without doing the correction in post-production? No, there is not. You have to use the presets. The whole point of the Cine EI mode is that you will do your color grading and corrections in post where you have far, far, far more control. The reason why you don't want to have a fully variable white balance in Cine EI is because white balance is a form of gain control. It controls the gain of the red and the blue channels relative to green. And if you start offsetting the gain of the green and blue channels by large amounts, you'll end up with clipping in those channels that isn't in the green channel, and you could potentially end up with footage that's ungradable. So Sony do some clever stuff in the camera with the white balance. They actually swing the RAW very slightly one way or the other according to the white balance that you've chosen to get the very best out of the camera, the very best off the sensor. Cameras are very noisy in the blue channel, so one of the things that you always want to try and do is have as little gain as possible in the blue channel. So Sony are doing some stuff within the camera that helps to get the very best possible picture. That does, though, tie you in to using presets and not variable, so that you don't get clipping problems and things like that in post-production. And it's actually the same on the Alexa as well. You have to, if you want to get the proper full dynamic range, you have to use preset white balance. So FS RAW protocol, this is taken pre-gain processing. ISO gain is now the job of the RAW receiving device, Shogun or Odyssey. Can the RAW receiving device change and use its own ISO gain settings? So what comes out of the camera is RAW, goes into the RAW recorder as RAW at a fixed ISO. And if you just record the RAW, you are just going to record the RAW. There would be no point in adding gain to the RAW. It's going to give you no benefit. It's just raw data. You may as well do that in post-production. But of course, what you can do with the Shogun, with the Odyssey, with all of these devices is you can also use them to convert from RAW to ProRes and record in ProRes. And when you do that, you apply a gamma curve to it. So it's no longer RAW, it's video with gamma. And then you can use LUT calc that I showed you earlier, and in case you weren't with us earlier, this is LUT calc here. And if you use a stop correction, if you go down 1 or 2 stops in LUT calc and create a LUT at a lower equivalent EI for your chosen gamma that you're going to use, whether that's 709, whether it's log or whatever, then you can effectively alter the ISO of the recording in the RAW recorder by passing the RAW through the LUT. So it's no longer RAW now, it's going to be regular conventional video, but you could make it S-log or you could make it 709 depending on what your requirements are, and you can use LUT calc to create LUTs with that exposure offset that's going to give you different effective ISOs of your recording. Come back because I'm running out of time. I'm great we've got so many questions. Yes, Adobe Prelude, that's right. You can use Adobe Prelude as well to change the FS5 clip names. Adobe Prelude is very, very good at that. You can tag clip numbers, incrementing clip numbers, so you just select a folder, all the clips in the folder, and tag them, and it will add incrementing clip numbers. You can actually completely change the renaming structure. Do be aware, though, that you don't want to break the relationship between the MXF files and the XML files. And this is actually something that's very important. The XML files actually tell the decoder how to decode the files properly. So XAVC uses a very advanced form of H.264. If the XML files aren't present, a lot of NLEs will just use a generic H.264 decoder because they can't find the XML file that has the information on how the clip is encoded. So the XML file is there to go alongside the clip. So the edit suite looks at the clip, then looks at the XML file, and the XML file will tell it, well, this is XAVC at this level, at this setting, so you decode the clip in this way, and that assures that you'll always get the best possible image quality. So those XML files, they are really important. If you rename or renumber the MXF clips, the MXF files, you must also do the same for the XML files. And actually, I'm saying that I need to check on that because I need to see how the NLEs reference those XMLs. So you do need to be a little bit careful in doing that. I'd have to do some research, actually. I think that warrants a post for the blog about that. Can this device use a lower ISO for the FS5 than Sony does internally? No. There'd be not. So if we're talking about using something like a Shogun to record RAW from the FS5, if you take the RAW output into the Shogun, you could create a lookup table with a lower ISO, and that will bring the levels down. You still have this same limitation if you were to create an S-Log2 or S-Log3 LUT. So you go from RAW to S-Log2, because you're going down in ISO, you will lose some dynamic range because your recording range won't go all the way up to the top. If I just show you that, actually maybe we'll be able to see this here. So if I've got this set up for S-Log3 input, it would be the same if it was for RAW. If I make S-Log3 LUT, it doesn't really matter what color space I have actually. If you look at the peak levels, they come down. So you actually lose a bit of your top recording range with a low LUT. If I bring this down a long way, let's go down, you'll see I'd never actually reach my peak recording range. So there are limitations as to how far you can go because you lose some top range and your blacks end up crushed. So you can use it to create an effectively lower ISO within reason, maybe a stop or so, but beyond that things get a little bit dicey. Let me see, come back to my questions, and I'm going to have to just take a couple more and then wrap things up. Yeah, you have to understand, so I've got a sort of comment here is that someone's saying that the 3200 ISO for S-Log is a lot for a 6-year-old sensor. It's a great sensor. It's a really good sensor. You know, and please, 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 it's not ISO. What ISO is just a number for light meters. What's important is gain. How much gain is the camera adding? At this point, it's actually adding none. It's 0 dB. So if you were to try and lower the ISO, you're going into negative gain territory. And if you go into negative gain territory, you cripple your dynamic range. That's why it's done. It is the native sensitivity of the sensor. And I don't know quite why it is a bit different between the FS5 and the FS7. It's obviously a difference between the image processing that's being used. Maybe the FS7 is capable of doing better, pull more out of the shadows than the FS5 is. I find that if I get great results shooting S-Log with the FS5, and noise is not an issue if you've exposed it properly. It just isn't. I can get really, really good results with it. So another question, is there a way to change a monitor LUT in camera with the F55, or are you stuck with the LUT values and need to load a new LUT? An example would be to take some green out of the monitor LUT while on set. Right, so no, you can't adjust the LUTs in the F55 while you're shooting. So once the LUT is loaded into the camera, that's it. You can't do anything much with it. One of the restrictions of the camera. You know, and actually most cameras that have LUTs are the same. If you go up to the F65, if you've got deep enough pockets, you can actually do it through something called a CDL color decision list in that camera. You can actually adjust the output while you're shooting, which is very, very nice. You actually monitor it on an iPad and do all sorts of clever stuff. But on the F5 and 55, no, you are stuck with the LUT as it is. I mean, one answer is if you're worried about green, if you know, to be honest though, if I've got too much green in my monitor when I'm shooting, I want to know about it when I shoot. Yes, I could fool myself and trick myself into thinking there isn't a problem with my lighting by taking it out in a LUT, but it's only hiding the problem. If you've got too much green, you need to invest in better lights or whatever it is. Get rid of whatever's causing the green problem. And don't forget, you can still use minus green filters and things like that in front of the lens as well. You don't have to, just because we've got LUTs and things, the old ways of doing things still work, still apply. So don't forget to, think about minus green filters and stuff like that. But really, if it's too much green, when I'm shooting, I want to know if there's a problem with my footage. I don't want to hide it on the set. Is there any talk of providing a waveform monitor on the FS5 in future firmware updates? I'm afraid I haven't heard any talk of that. The processing clearly in the FS5 is based on the A7S cameras. They don't have waveform. Whether it's possible to add, I don't know. And I have not heard any comments or rumors of that coming. It's certainly something that I've requested and lots of people would love to have, but I've heard no rumor of one coming. I noticed in S-Log3 the image clips at around 90 IRE instead of the full range like S-Log2. Is there any way to make the camera use the whole range in S-Log2, any way to make the camera use the whole range in S-Log3, or is S-Log3 probably made to be future-proof for 15 or 16 stops of DR? It's a bit of both of those. No, there is no way to make the camera use the full range of S-Log3 because the camera's only got 14 stops, so it is only going to go to 92 IRE. Yes, S-Log3 can deal with 16 stops, and that's because S-Log3 is based on Cine, and Cine can also do 16 stops. If you were to stretch it out so it went all the way up to 100 stops, if your 14 stops went all the way to 100%, it would no longer be S-Log3 or Cine. It would be some other curve. Maybe that's something Sony will do. Maybe they'll have an S-Log4 that does that, but it won't be S-Log3 anymore. Your LUTs wouldn't work for S-Log3. You'd have to redo everything. So in a word, no. Yes, in the future, when we do have cameras with greater dynamic range, then perhaps they will make use of that extended range that it's capable of. I'm really going to have to start wrapping this up. I will take one or two more questions. Had a question for the lower bitrate FS5 and in reference to the 420 of the A6300. When shooting S-Log2 and S-Log3, why is it that when using a waveform I make sure I don't clip? Yet I've never seemed to be able to recover the highlights very well. Could you explain what you want to aim for in terms of IRE scale for most outdoor sunny day shooting? Well, that's going to be a post-production issue. You don't, when you shoot with log, the best way to shoot with log is to not focus on the highlights, ignore the highlights, get the mid-range right. That's what you need to get right. And with any of these log cameras, right the way from A6300 all the way up to F5, F55, you really want to be a stop to a stop and a half above the Sony levels. So the Sony recommended levels, which are these, they're actually too dark. You really want to be exposed brighter than that. You want to be exposed 1 to 2 stops over. So instead of white being at 60%, you want to have it at 70%, and that is going to give you a much better result. But then it comes down to your post-production workflow. To recover those highlights, you need to use a proper grading tool. And I've come across it many times with footage that I've shot in log, where I have deliberately overexposed it, and I brought it into Premiere, and I tried to use the lumetri panel to recover the highlights, and it just won't pull them back out. There's a ton of information in those highlights. What you have to understand is that most editing packages are based around standard gammas. They don't really understand log. Go into DaVinci Resolve and apply an S-curve to your footage before you grade it, and you'll be able to pull a ton of information out of those highlights. The S-curve is simply a case of taking the luminance curve in DaVinci Resolve, take a point towards the bottom of the curve and pull it down, take a point towards the top of the luminance curve and pull it up. So you have kind of like an S lying on its side shape, and then grade your footage, and you'll find you'll be able to recover your highlights and pull all that lovely information that is in those highlights, even if they are clipped. There's in fact an incredible amount of highlight information even in a clipped highlight. Just an example of that here. So this is S-Log. Let me get the right slide up for you. Ungraded S-Log2. And if you look at these highlights, they are very bright. And in fact, they even look clipped. This middle area here in the middle of the chapel door looks clipped. But when you grade it, if you grade it properly, it's not clipped. And there's loads of information, there's loads of texture, and up here as well, loads of picture information that looks clipped when you shoot it, but it's all there. So don't worry about your highlights, just get the mid-range right by exposing one as stops over and grade with a proper grading tool. Shotgun mic for the FS5 when shooting interviews. I'd like to be able to use it on board and also on a boom. 416. The old Sennheiser 416. You can't get better than a Sennheiser 416. Lovely, lovely microphone. But if you're going to have an effective shotgun, it is going to be a long microphone. I would always tend to go for those microphones. FS5 RAW and FS7 RAW, do they look the same? Same sensor? More or less, there are very slight differences, again, because the processors in the cameras are different. They don't quite look identical, but it's damned close. And if you want to make those cameras match, that's probably the closest you can go. What do I use most between the vector scope and the histogram? Vector scope I rarely use, to be honest, or histogram I tend to use the waveform monitor, where I have one. Waveform monitor is by far the most useful tool. It's a tool that was designed for video applications, so that's the one that I use the most. And I've had quite a few questions about that, so I think I'm going to have to do a video or at least a blog page on waveform monitors and how to use them and things like that. So I really do have to wrap things up now. I am running out of time rapidly. Great to have so many questions, really was. I do hope everyone found this useful, and hopefully we'll do some more. Really good to have so many people signing in and so many questions. So hopefully that will allow me to pick up some sponsorships. We can do this on a regular basis, answer as many questions as possible for you guys to make your lives easy. And I look forward perhaps to the next time. So do enjoy the rest of your day, wherever in the world you are. I see we have people from all over the world logged in, which is really cool. I hope you found it useful. If you did, tell your friends, tell your mates, spread the word, and let's try and make this a regular thing. You will receive an email from me probably tomorrow now that will have the link to the recording of this session. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are.